The events that began last February that commemorate and celebrate the 250th anniversary of the start of the American Revolution, along with many other exciting events across the state, are sponsored by the Massachusetts Office of Travel and Tourism. They have been an incredible support for us this year and last year. It's part of the Mass 250 campaign. We are very grateful to be one of the communities chosen for the second year in a row to tell our revolutionary story. So the grant that sponsors this event, as I mentioned, is a partnership with Cushing House Maritime Museum, Lowell's Boat Shop, Newburyport, Chamber of Commerce, the North of Boston Convention and Visitors Bureau, Firehouse Center, Theater in the Open, all sorts of other community partners. So just a wonderful community-wide event. So it is my great pleasure to introduce you to Emily Murphy, who is the curator of the Salem Maritime National Historic Park and Saugus Ironworks National Historic Site. She holds a BA in Liberal Arts from St. John's College, Annapolis, an MA in American Studies from Penn State, and a PhD in American Studies from Boston University. Dr. Murphy has been working in public history for over 30 years, including at the Maryland State Archives, the Hammond Harwood House in Annapolis, Independence National Historic Park, and the Peabody Essex Museum. Her major publications for the National Park Service include the Walking Tour Guide, Nathaniel Hawthorne's Salem, and Merchants, Clerks, Citizens, and Soldiers, a history of the Second Corps of Cadets, for which she was awarded the Honorable Order of St. Barbara from the United States Field Artillery Association. Most recently, she contributed the chapter, The Family of Derby Has a Taste in This Way, the homes of Elias Haskett and Elizabeth Derby, in the book, A Material World, Culture, Society, and the Life of Things in Early Anglo-America, edited by George Boudreau and Margaretta Lovell. She is currently working on a set of exhibits about privateering that will be installed at Salem Maritime in the summer of 2026. And let me also just say, she has been an extraordinary help and a wonderful colleague and friend. For these many years, she is the first person who helped me dress as a colonial wench for the first Tails and Ales. And I'll tell you, if any of you went to Tails and Ales, you know that was an outfit that I got lots of life out of. So with that, please join me in welcoming Emily Murphy.
Well, first off, thank you guys so much for hosting this. This is definitely a needed thing to be talking about privateering. And I also want to just add a shout out to my intern, because as anyone who works in the public history field knows, we run on our interns, and my fantastic intern, Ruben Downey, who's here today, is the person who did a lot of the research that is going into both this lecture, but more importantly, the exhibits that are going in at Salem Maritime this summer. So I just want to say, go interns. So in Massachusetts, when we think of the Revolutionary War, this is the image that immediately comes to mind. And I'm not just putting this up because my husband works at Minuteman National Historical Park. So we've got marching redcoats, colonial militia, and land battles like those at Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill. But the land war in Massachusetts lasted for less than a year. And with the withdrawal of the British from Boston in March 1776, Massachusetts did not have another major battle on its soil. However, the war continued on, not only for those thousands of Massachusetts soldiers who joined the Continental Army, but the thousands of sailors who served their country at sea. So this morning, I'm going to explore how the war at sea affected the port communities of Essex County. And I'm going to apologize in the advance. I'm going to be Salem-centric because Salem is the hub of my universe. I've been living, eating, and breathing it for about 25 years now. But a lot of what I'm talking about does apply to the other port communities, and you'll see some folks sneaking in from Beverly and Newburyport and other communities as well. So this is Essex County in about 1770. So you'll notice that several of the towns that we know well, like Saugus, Swampscott, and Hamilton don't exist yet, and Bradford has been returned to its rightful place among Essex County towns. So who was living in Essex County at this time? I'm going to begin with an examination of two sources that give us an idea of the population at the time. First is the Massachusetts Census of 1764, which I found at the Phillips Library at the Peabody Essex Museum. Unfortunately, only the summaries survive for the towns in Massachusetts, but there are some interesting conclusions to draw from them. First, this is a snapshot of conditions before the war. A lot of people start to move around the countryside in the 1770s, particularly with the closure of the ports, but it does give us a good general idea. As you can see, Essex County is by far the most populous county in Massachusetts. And when you look at the town summaries, 80% of the population of Essex County is situated along the coastline near the major ports of Salem, Marblehead, Beverly, Ipswich, Gloucester, and Newburyport. Newburyport, unfortunately, there's a little note right here. The inhabitants of Newbury and the inhabitants of Newburyport and numbers. Newbury apparently didn't read the directions and got their numbers in late. So we only have totals for them and not breakdowns by age and race as we have for the other towns. So I don't know how typical that is of Newbury, but something I would have expected. So I pulled the numbers from this census for these towns and Boston, just for comparison, although neither of us really care about Boston. First, the number of houses versus the number of families is a really interesting number to take a look at. So on average, in these more densely settled ports, there are at least two families per house. And this means that, these were pretty densely packed towns. And this is where having the schedules would have been really helpful to know how they were defining family units within a house. And also, speaking of family units, look at this. The largest segments of the population in any of these towns are women over the age of 16. We talk a lot in my field about how there are a lot of women in these ports doing things, and that it's a kind of a female-centric society, and it's really great to have the numbers kind of bear that out. And we see in a lot of newspaper ads of women in business, generally female-coded businesses like school teaching or shops focused on fabric and clothing accessories. We can also see the largest black population is also found in these port communities. Most were enslaved to the wealthier families in town in their homes and businesses, but there is a small and growing free black population. It's also helpful to note that the total population, Marblehead and Salem, are each about a quarter the size of Boston before the war. The other source is the Massachusetts tax valuation of 1771, which a professor at Harvard University kindly turned into a database. And when you look at this source, in comparison to the census of 1764, it's really kind of interesting. So this source does come with some caveats. You can't use it as a census because it's focused on males ages 16 and up. Although there are women who appear in this as property holders, usually as widows. But if you account for a little bit of growth in 6 years, it's really interesting to see that almost a little more than all of the males over 16 have enough money are making enough money to be paying taxes. Whereas you look at Marblehead, and it's less than half of the males over 16 are taxable. And then same thing with Ipswich is almost even, Gloucester is almost even as well. So these port communities, particularly Salem and Marblehead, have been operating for over a century as a cash economy, which meant that starting in the mid-17th century, there were a growing number of families who did not own enough land to grow the food they needed to feed their families. And thus, they were reliant on earning enough cash to purchase the necessities of living, from food to clothes to rent for their dwelling place. And the basis of this economy is this guy, the cod, caught on deep sea banks off of Massachusetts, dried and shipped to the markets, either in the Catholic countries of Southern Europe, where fish was a required part of the diet on fast days, or cheaper refuse cod to the plantations of the West Indies, where it was a cheap source of protein for the slaves harvesting and processing sugar. Marblehead and Gloucester accounted for 60% of all the fish caught annually in New England. And the port communities of Massachusetts shipped nearly all the cod sent to Southern Europe, and 45% of the cod shipped to the Caribbean. So the trade in cod along with timber products from the coast of Maine, which is then part of Massachusetts, really formed the basis of a thriving network of trade across the Atlantic. And it was very common that fishing vessels would go for cod in the spring, summer, and fall, and then in the winter sail down the coast to the Caribbean to trade the dried fish for a variety of both food products like flour, molasses, and sugar, and as well as luxury items that had been brought in by vessels from Europe. In addition, there were numerous vessels that did just trade, running down the coast of North America and then across to Europe to trade with British allies, coming back with tea, coffee, porcelain, and porcelain brought in from Asia, as well as British wool and linen. However, this is also a period of increasing wealth gap, as merchant families like the Tracy family here in Newburyport, the Sargents in Gloucester, the Cabots in Beverly, the Pickmans in Salem, and the Lees in Marblehead increasingly controlled shipping and fishing in Essex County, and all of whom in the 1760s through the late 1770s built these enormous mansions. So by the time of the American Revolution, only about 2% of fishermen owned their own vessels, because the emphasis had been moving over the last century to larger vessels that could not only handle a larger haul of fish, but then they could be turned around and used for international trading in the off-season. So owning their own vessel was out of reach for working fishermen. And in 1763, merchants Robert Hooper and Jeremiah Lee of Marblehead estimated that it cost about £1,135 to run a banker, as they called the fishing vessels. Like the schooner Baltic is a great example of the type of vessel that they would be using at this point. So you would set up the vessel, outfit the crew, including providing advances, clothing, and food for their families. And this would be what you would be paying for a year's worth of work. That is $213,422 in today's money. So it was common at that point for merchants to band together to spread the potential losses across several vessels, whether they be fishing vessels or mercantile vessels. Fishermen were most commonly paid in shares of the profit of the voyage, the experience of the officer and the crew being reflected by the number of shares assigned to each person. Less commonly, they might be paid by the number of fish caught or by straight wages, i.e. a flat wage per month. On a trading vessel, crew was usually paid a wage, but were allowed an adventure. And this was a certain amount of space in the hold to either ship something to sell yourself or to sell back to the owners that they could use for another investor's cargo. For a trading voyage, a schooner like Baltic would have a crew of 3 to 5 and a captain as young as 17 to 18. Sailing was physically demanding, fishing even more so, and both were a young man's occupation. I mean, you saw the handsome Captain Elias that so impressed his daughter. But so according to Daniel Vickers, the late, great Daniel Vickers, the average working life of a man at sea was between the ages of about 14 and 30. And at that point, they would then transition either to working in one of the many supporting trades, like Ashley Bowen of Marblehead, who moved from sailing to rigging at around the age of 33, or if they were related to one of the wealthier families, they would move into mercantile efforts, like Richard Darby Jr., the Darby family of Salem, who left the sea around the age of 30 to focus on mercantile trading and government service for the Patriot cause. So all of this has been a very long preamble to set the scene for entering on privateering. Essex County's economy was prime for an easy transition to privateering. We have a large fleet of vessels. We've got sailors who are familiar with all the major trading routes and who are used to being paid on a share system. Merchants who had amassed enough wealth to take on the financial risks of privateering, and the infrastructure to support the trade. So the only missing piece is how support for the Patriots grew in these towns. So the 1760s particularly were a difficult time to be trading in the Caribbean. Many merchants were having similar experiences during the 7 Years' War to the Darby family of Salem. That included Elias Haskett Derby, along with his father Richard Sr. and his brothers Richard Jr. and John. They felt that the Royal Navy was not only not protecting them from the French, but they were also allowing British privateers too much leeway in seizing American vessels suspected of smuggling. Spoiler alert, they were smuggling. The port communities in Massachusetts were heavily affected by British policies in the lead up to the American Revolution. The Sugar Act of 1764 cracked down on trade with non-British ports, reducing the amount of sugar and molasses that American merchants could ship. This was complicated because the British islands did not produce enough sugar to meet British demand. And so American merchants were often kind of strong-armed into smuggling French molasses and sugar pretty openly, and this was mostly winked at by British customs official. But further, the act created an admiralty court in Halifax to hear all cases of smuggling rather than using the local courts, where everybody was smuggling too, and therefore they would let their fellow merchants off. So this was yet another way that the British tried to bring the colonies into line by removing local autonomy. And this was a move that the locals reacted to through violent attacks on customs officials in the Massachusetts ports. The Stamp Act of 1765 meant merchants had to pay a tax on each of the many documents needed to complete a trading voyage. The Currency Act stopped colonies from issuing their own money, and that disrupted the commerce. The Townshend Act heavily taxed certain goods going to the colonies and cut into merchants' profits. And then the Tea Act gave the East India Company a monopoly on tea in the colonies, cutting out the many small merchants who would carry tea from Britain to America. And then the Intolerable Acts closed the port of Boston to all trade. It is no wonder that many merchants and mariners saw Parliament and the Lords of Trade as corrupt and actively working against the interest of the American maritime economy. With the outbreak of hostilities on April 19, 1775, the port communities immediately began thinking about privateering. And on November 1st, 1775, as we've heard, Massachusetts passed the act giving the Governor's Council the power to, quote, commission with letters of marque and reprisal any person or persons within this colony who shall, at his or their own expense, fit out and equip for the defense of America any vessel, as also any person who shall by this owner of the vessel be recommended therefor. And then this act set up prize courts. The Essex County one was originally in Ipswich, although it was later amended so that the court could be held in Boston, Salem, or Newburyport to make it more convenient. Now, it's claimed that Nathaniel Tracy of Newburyport was the first to send out a privateer under the Massachusetts Act from the area, and Salem's Elias Haskett Darby 17-ton schooner Dolphin was the second privateer commissioned under the Massachusetts Act, but they didn't quite have their act together, and so the Dolphin almost immediately got a prize, but the local committee of safety then ends up having to write to the Governor's Council and be like, what do we do with the prisoners? And so they had to quickly scramble and figure that out. And privateering quickly became a necessity rather than a luxury. So the aggressive response by the Royal Navy, patrolling ports, blocking up ports, capturing both fishing vessels and trading vessels, dramatically cut into the fishing economy and caused people to flee the coast. So between April of 1775 and April of 1776, merchants on Cape Ann reported to the legislature a loss of trade amounting to 27,900 pounds. That's over 5.2 million in today's economy. Further, they reported that 11,600 feet of wharf is useless and 48 warehouses useless, and, quote, 300 families moved 4 miles out of town at great expense. Salem reported for the same period a loss of 32,000 pounds, over 6 million in today's economy. So, if an Essex County merchant wanted to go into privateering, he first had to decide if he was going to own or invest. Investing meant a smaller return, but less work on his end. Somebody else was taking care of most of the paperwork. He just had to either pay out or get the return. If he was going to own, then he had to decide if he was going to run a privateer, which is a vessel that's just going out to capture vessels. That's its only purpose. Or if he was going to run a letter of marque vessel. And this is a vessel that has a cargo, is doing a trading voyage, but has that letter of marque just in case they come across a nice prize. Generally, you could have less of a return on a letter of marque vessel because they're not capturing a lot of prizes, but at the same time, at least if that trade is successful, you at least have the money from that. So he then had to acquire or repurpose a vessel. By far, the most popular types of vessels were either schooners or brigantines. So there's a schooner, there's a brigantine. These are both fast and maneuverable vessels, ideal for the use near the coasts, and they were the mainstay of the New England fleet before the war. Now, as the war goes on and more vessels get captured, the shipbuilding industry starts to catch up, more merchants then start investing in building ships. And Elias Haskett Darby in Salem, Nathaniel Tracy in Newburyport, both are heavily invested in ships by the end of the war. Then you have to give your vessel a name. And so remember, this is a time when people are very consciously creating personas. And so for a merchant, your vessel names are part of an expression of your house. And so the Darbys are a great example of this. Before the war, their fleet included the Snow Earl of Derby, the largest ship in their string, the schooner Exeter, which is where the family was from in England, and the brig Salisbury, which is the town right near Exeter, and the sloop Royal Oak, all of them proudly declaring their English antecedents. By 1770, the Darbys had added the American and Free American to their fleet. The privateers that they sent out during the Revolutionary War, this is when Elias Haskett Darby really kind of takes over the privateering side of things, carried names like Bunker Hill, Congress, Franklin, Lexington, Monmouth, Revenge, Revolt, Scorpion, and True American. Haskett was also heavily invested in the Oliver Cromwell, named after the man who overthrew the English monarchy. Another name that he actually favored, just as a side note, was Sturdy Beggar, which he gave first to a brig and then after her capture to a schooner. And the same goes with the Massachusetts Navy. When Massachusetts starts building the naval vessels, they decide to name one of the vessels the Tyrannicide, which, if that doesn't send a message, I don't know what will. There was also the Rising Empire, the Republic, and the Freedom. So the owners and partners would outfit a ship, hire a captain. Often the captain would also be a partner in the vessel as well. And the captain would post a bond of around £4,000 and then get a commission from the state and the Congress. And the bond was there to ensure that he followed the laws of privateering. There's a very strict set of rules that must be followed in terms of what type of ship you can capture, what you do with any prisoners who are aboard or any passengers who are aboard, and then you follow the rules again about bringing things to adjudication. The best way to describe it today is like the difference between hunting and poaching, right? So hunting is a very regulated activity. There are very distinct rules about what you can hunt with, where you can hunt, what you can hunt, and when you can hunt. Poaching, on the other hand, is completely, is completely illegal. And at least where I'm from in Pennsylvania, if you call a hunter a poacher, that will start a bar fight, because you're accusing somebody of something that is not only illegal, but it is immoral, right? So that's kind of the way that people thought about privateers at that time. So then there's the question of insurance. If the owners did not want to take the whole risk of the voyage onto themselves, they could purchase insurance. Before the war, the insurance for a merchant vessel traveling from the Caribbean to Boston was around 3% of the amount insured. But the war changed all that. By the end of 1776, British merchants were paying as much as 32% on their insurance. And in 1780, a vessel sailing with cargo from Beverly to the Caribbean was paying 40%. Now, you could insure a privateer, like the Monmouth here, if you're willing to pay 60% to insure the vessel, boat, and stores. But this is another way that folks are making money, right? Because look at these are all the same merchants who are also investing in privateers are also signing on for these to back these insurance claims, these insurance policies. So this is another way for them to make some money off of this. So the partners would then hold a rendezvous to get a crew. And between August 9th and August 18th, 1781, Captain David Ropes of the schooner Lark, we don't know which tavern this was, but it was one of the ones in Salem, he spent 21 pounds 6 shillings, that's about $4,000 today, on 34 bowls of punch and 3 bowls of grog at a Salem tavern for a several rendezvous to get crew for his upcoming cruise. And if you notice, most of that was on the 18th, where he purchases 22 bowls of punch. At one point, I think Elias Heskett Derby buys 106 bowls of punch, cherry toddy, and grog for one of his rendezvous. So signing probably seemed really logical after that. So privateers would carry a large cruise for their size. A small schooner doing a coastal trip would have a crew of maybe 4 to 5, whereas a full-size ship would have a crew of about a dozen if it were doing a mercantile cruise. However, as privateers, which needed sailors to man the cannons, sail the vessel, provide crews to sail the captured vessels home, these vessels could have as much as 10 times as many crew. One Salem ship, the Junius Brutus, again, killing a tyrant, so we named our ships after them, had a crew of 121, including 92 sailors and 29 officers and staff. The crew were paid with shares, depending on their rank. So the captain got 9 shares, officers would get between 2 and 6 shares, the seaman would get 1 for an able-bodied seaman, so that's the most experienced seaman, 3/4 for an ordinary seaman, and 1/2 for a boy. The prize, when the prize was auctioned, the results would be divided in half generally. Half would go to the owners to be split among the owners, the other half divided among the crew. So I wasn't able to find any records of the Junius Brutus's prizes, but if they were lucky and came in with a couple of prizes that were auctioned for about £12,000, which is not unusual in the auction records, the crew could expect about £34 per share. Before the war, an average crewman's wages on a trading vessel was about 30 to 40 shillings per month. That's 18 to 24 pounds a year. So that's more than a year's pay in one cruise. So it's not surprising that in August of 1776, James Warren wrote to Samuel Adams from Boston, quote, "The spirit of privateering prevails here greatly. Success of those who have before engaged in that business have been sufficient to make the whole country privateering mad." A lively market in privateer shares existed in the Essex County port communities, especially among the women of the town. Sailors would often appoint their wives, their mothers, or in one case, quote, "my trusty and well-beloved friend Sarah Hendley of Marblehead," one wonders what the story is behind that, with a power of attorney to collect prize money and to sell parts of shares to make some extra money. So in this document from the Phillips Library, we have, in September 1778, Deliverance, her name's actually Pedrick, but it's spelled Penderick on this, Perlindrick, sorry. She sold 1/4 of her husband's share in, I believe this is the America, the Brig America. And she sold this to Mrs. Hannah Breed for $90, probably the Massachusetts dollars. This is a gamble because the sale of shares, by selling that money, she's got cash in hand to support her family. But that cuts into the amount of money that they could potentially be making if the privateer comes back successfully. But likewise, Hannah Breed is also taking a risk. If they have a poor or an unsuccessful cruise, that means she could either lose part or all of her money to do that. So the next thing to do is to go get some prizes. The three most popular areas to cruise were off the coast of Nova Scotia and Newfoundland to grab vessels heading in and out of Halifax with fish and trade goods, the coast of Ireland for vessels heading to Liverpool, and then down into the Caribbean to get vessels heading in and out of the British islands down there. Many privateering encounters ended without a shot being fired, as a show of force was all that was necessary to make a merchant captain lower his flag and surrender. Especially if that captain happened to be carrying insurance, it was less of a risk to just surrender than it was to fight. Captain Hugh Hill, who commanded many of the Beverly privateers, was one who used a lot of subterfuge. He was a great user of the false flag, as we've heard, and he would lure British ships until they were close enough to board and take without a fight. There is a kind of an interesting story, which might be a little bit exaggerated, of Hugh Hill deceiving a British ship captain who was looking for him. So Hill was not prepared for a battle when this ship approaches him, and so he hoists a British ensign. When the British captain asks Hill if he had seen Hugh Hill, Hill responds that he hadn't, and he was actually looking for him himself. And so the ships apparently crossed paths again a couple of days later, and at that point, Hill was ready for a fight and ended up taking that British vessel. So there's also a significant number of prizes that fought back. In 1776, Nathaniel Hawthorne's grandfather, Daniel, was wounded when his schooner True American attacked the brig Sally, and I will not subject you to all 16 verses of the ballad supposedly written by the ship's doctor. Although, interestingly, I found an article in a literary magazine saying that this can't be found any earlier than the mid-19th century. They can't find any contemporary documentation. So it looks like it may have been somebody sucking up to Nathaniel Hawthorne by extolling the virtues of his grandfather. We've already heard about Captain Jonathan Harrington and the Golden Eagle and the Pickering, but what's really kind of interesting about that battle is how it ends up getting reported in the newspapers. So the newspapers are constantly reporting on any kind of news that comes across about what ships have taken what, where they were, that sort of thing. And when Harrington's story is told, there's an interesting little line at the end. He has, upon all occasions, signalized himself as a man of undaunted courage and as a true friend and a faithful servant of the cause of America. So it's quite obvious that the author is trying to, in some ways, sort of counteract this idea that it's kind of all a money grab. The letter from John Warren there saying that it's just everybody's privateering mad is there is kind of that sentiment going on. But he's a patriot. And then of course we've got the cups and the mugs. So a big danger was running across a British naval vessel or privateer. The British Navy was really aggressive in its pursuit of American privateers and its protection of busy ports like Halifax, Nova Scotia. On May 28, 1782, the Salem privateer Jack, captained by David Ropes, approached what they thought was a merchant vessel heading into Halifax. They quickly found that the brig was in fact the HMS Observer and tried to escape. Observer gave chase, and after a 2-hour battle in which Captain Ropes was killed and both vessels had their sails shot up, finally captured Jack. Her surviving crew was taken into Halifax, where they were held on prison ships in the harbor until their release could be arranged. This is one of the problems I'm having as I'm working on my exhibit, is there's not a lot of visuals about Revolutionary War privateering. Tons of paintings of the War of 1812 and privateering, but the majority of images that are contemporary that you see were all commissioned by the victorious British captains. So it kind of always gives a view of the American privateers as just about to collapse. Of course, most famously, that scene of the Penobscot with a fire in the background of the American vessels, of course, was commissioned by the British captain who was in charge of the fleet at that point. So a similar story early in the war occurs with Captain James Tracy of the Yankee Hero sailing from Newburyport. They attempted to capture the British ship Milford, realized it was a ship of war. They were outgunned and attempted to disengage. This was not successful. The battle went on for hours off of Cape Ann. Tracy was shot in the thigh and unable to walk, and the crew was imprisoned after the Milford captured them. Similarly, the Oliver Cromwell was able to escape attack by a British frigate after the British ship fired broadside into her when a gale blew up off of Florida. But the storm became a hurricane and it so badly damaged the vessel that Elias Heskett Derby sold her when she got back to Salem. So once you captured a prize, if you were lucky enough to capture a prize, those would be sent back to an American port where there would be a hearing in the court, and what's called the legal term is a libel would be filed against the captured vessel by the captors. And then it would be judged whether that vessel was captured according to the laws of privateering. While you think this might be a rubber stamp, especially in situations where Judge Timothy Pickering was probably either related to or went to church with most of the privateer captains who have libels in front of him, there are actually several instances, many instances, where the captured vessel was shown not to be a fair capture, mainly because it was found to be owned by an American merchant who adhered to the Patriot cause. Just as an aside here, this ad contains the announcement of the libel of the Snow Jenny, William Cummings' master. There's a great little story about the Jenny that I found in some of the British papers. And the Jenny was captured by the Free American in the fall of '76, and she got auctioned off. There were 3 crewmen, the William Cummings, who was the captain, and 2 crew, James Poor and Patrick Shaw. And they were not prisoners because they're not fighting against the Americans, they were just out on a trading trip. And so they were released. The merchant who then bought the Jenny at auction proceeded to hire James Poor as one of the crewmen. Poor, of course, promptly, once he has access to the Jenny, promptly goes and finds his former crewmates, smuggles them on board, cuts the lines, and takes the Jenny out of Salem Harbor under cover of darkness. And they head back to England, where they turn the vessel over to the authorities. And their story is captured in these interrogatories that are asked of all folks who are dealing with privateering in Britain. So if it was a good capture, the cargo was then sold at auction by agents who would then distribute money to the owners, masters, and crew according to the number of shares. And the agent, of course, would get a cut, another way that money could be made off of privateering. And Edward Jabot was the agent for many of the Derby vessels. Another agent in Salem was the enslaved man, Titus Cabot, we have one mention of him in the diary of lawyer William Pynchon. In 1781, he makes out Elizabeth Cabot's will, and in it, she leaves Titus 40 pounds and his freedom if he does not run away before she dies. Pynchon then records in his diary, Titus cares not, as he gets money apace, being one of the agents for some of the privateersmen, and wears cloth shoes, ruffled shirts, silk breeches and stockings, and dances the minuet at Harvard's commencement. It is said he has made more profit as agent than Mr. Ansel Alcock or Dr. Whitaker. So he's one of these ghosts that sort of flit through the history here, because this is the only mention we have of him. I've not been able to find any documents where he's actually acting as an agent, which is unsurprising because so much of the documentation relating to privateering has disappeared over the years. So after the British left Massachusetts in 1776, Boston and the other port communities became one of the safest areas to bring prizes to in North America. According to historian Richard Buell, on average, about 20,100 tons of captured cargo was condemned in Massachusetts between 1776 and 1782. Eric already talked about William Bingham and the very important work that he did in terms of getting France to sort of enter. But for our folks, one of the most important thing he did was to get France to agree to allow the Vice Admiralty courts to adjudicate prizes in French ports, which now meant that instead of having, if you captured a vessel in the Caribbean, instead of having to take it all the way back to a friendly port, you could go into Martinique, get it adjudicated, and cash in on the prize. So in 1777, the privateer sloop Revenge took the 200-ton ship Royal Charlotte, and her cargo was sold at auction in Salem. And this includes 54 hogsheads of beans, 19 hogsheads of oats, 3 bottles of anchovies, 12 shillings 6 apiece, Cheshire cheese, tin and iron kitchenware, wine glasses, decanters, hair powder, a lady's side hunting saddle, 2 suits of boys' clothes, calico, tallow, butter, bread, a jar of raisins for 15 shillings, porter, port wine, champagne, grindstones, and stays, among many, many other items. And total, that single auction brought in 5,718 pounds. One of the most interesting privateer prizes was the Scientific Library of Richard Curwen, a Fellow of the Royal Society elected for his research in chemistry. In 1781, he was shipping his library from Ireland to Bristol, England, when the ship it was on, not him, he was on a different vessel, was captured by the Beverly privateer Pilgrim. That library was purchased by a group of gentlemen in Salem, and it became the Philosophical Library, a lending library, and it's one of 2 libraries that became the Salem Athenaeum in 1810, and that collection is still at the Salem Athenaeum today. Really cool direct connection to privateering right in the heart of Salem. And so who's buying stuff at these auctions, right? So a group of auction book from privateer sales in Salem has survived. And one of the really interesting things that you see is who's there. Friday, May 14th, 1778, sales of the following articles. Molly Hawthorne buys 368 yards of white linen at 16 shillings for 294 pounds. 1 dozen linen handkerchiefs for 68 shillings a dozen, 3 pairs of silk hose, 1 for 40 shillings and 2 for 44 shillings each, 10 yards of light blue calamanco at 7 shillings a yard for £3.10. Sarah Hawthorne, I don't think she's on this one, Sarah Hawthorne later buys 2 casks of indigo for over £100. So Molly, or Mary Hawthorne, is buying almost 100 yards in this one, 100 yards of superfrying broadcloth for between 6 and 7 pounds a yard. It turns out, I started doing some hunting, Mary and Sarah Hawthorne were cousins of Nathaniel Hawthorne and were very successful shopkeepers and merchants. All told, they spent about 1,355 pounds on goods, which is about the cost of a mid-sized vessel in one of these auctions, and the equivalent of over $260,000 in today's money. So these were not women who were doing a little bit of side trading. These were women who were established shopkeepers before the war, and they were only continuing their work here. After the war, Mary actually goes on to own a couple of schooners in her own right and have captains working for her. And she died with an estate in 1802 of about $30,000, which is, I believe, well over $3 million in today's money. So these are women, and there's like no ads about them. They're women who obviously have a very exclusive clientele. They have no need to put ads in the newspapers. And so it really shows that, that women are finding ways to to make money off of this privateering as well. There's also Deborah Cabot, another member of the Cabot family, is seen in these auction records as well. She's buying substantial amounts of fabrics, particularly. James Warren pointed out to Samuel Adams in August of 1776, many kinds of West India goods that we used to be told we should suffer for want of are now plentier and cheaper than I have known them for many years. After years of showing patriotism through boycotts and non-importation agreements and wearing of homespun, it was now, in Essex County, a patriotic duty to show off the fine goods captured from these British merchant vessels. There is a problem, though. The stuff that's coming in on the vessels tend to be high-end goods. If there's food like salt, beef, or pork, it gets snapped up by merchants who will sell it to the army. This created a real hardship, particularly in port communities like Marblehead, whose fishing had collapsed partially due to a lack of salt for packing the fish. In 1779, Marblehead resident Edward Bowen tracked the rising price of necessities in his almanac diary. In April, he records the rising price of wood. It's now $40 a cord. Pork, $2 a pound. Beef, 5 shillings a pound. Interestingly, he uses a combination of pound sterling and Massachusetts dollars. Butter, $3. And he also keeps an eye on the Indian corn and the wheat. By September, beef is 5 shillings a pound. Mutton and lamb are 4 shillings a pound, but neither are to be got. He says, wood, not to be got for money. Meal, ditto, nothing to be had but for salt. So if you had salt, you could trade, but otherwise people weren't even taking cash. In November, beef, 8 shillings. Pork, not to be got. Coffee, $6. Wood, $110. That same year, this broadside appeared, supposedly written by a daughter of liberty living in Marblehead, and one of the verses reads, "For money is not worth a pin. Had we but salt, we've had anything. For salt is all the farmers cry. If we've no salt, we sure must die." In 1776 and 1777, women in Salem, Marblehead, and Beverly actually rioted over the cost of bread, coffee, sugar, and other provisions. And in December of 1776, Salem merchant John White recorded in his diary, "Great dearness of provisions owing to the great quantity which depreciates fast, especially the article of salt, which sells at 12 shillings a bushel." That's nearly 3 times its pre-war price. A few days later, he wrote, "The inhabitants of this town are so mutinous, they threaten me for selling salt at 12 shillings a bushel." So, yes, a lot of money is flowing in, but the cost of necessities is really rising. So it's really interesting to see, a lot of these folks after the war, they don't have as much money as you think they should, and this is probably one of the reasons for it. By the middle of the war, worse fate than being wounded by a cannonball in the high seas was being captured by the British. Many of them, as we've heard, ended up on the Jersey or the Mill Prison in Dartmoor or Fortin Prison in Plymouth, England. Caleb Foote, a Salem man who was unlucky enough to be captured only 10 days into his first privateering voyage, then spent 2 years in Fortin Prison and another year and a half trying to get home after he escaped in 1780. Some of the heartbreaking letters that he wrote home to his wife still exist. Fortin Prison, June the 30th, 1779. "My dear and most affectionate friend, with pleasure, I embrace the opportunity to write you a line, to inquire after your welfare, which I look upon as dear as my own." She gave birth 2 days before he left. I have not had the happiness to hear from you since we parted. But I trust by the blessing of God these lines will find you and our children in as good a health as they leave me at the present writing. I have enjoyed a good state of health since I left home, although I have gone through many hardships and troubles. But my greatest trouble is my long absence from you. I trust that you will be provided for better than I can imagine. For my part, I have not greatly suffered on account of provisions, but I have felt the want of clothing. 7 months later, he was much less optimistic about his experience. February the 24th, 1780. Most affectionate friend, I take this opportunity to write you a few lines to acquaint you of my welfare, which is very poor at present, for here we lie in prison, in a languishing condition, upon very short allowance, surrounded by tyrants, and with no expectation of being redeemed at present. For we seem to be cast out and forsaken by our country, and no one to grant us any relief in our distress. And many of our noble countrymen are sick and languishing for want of things to support nature in this lowest state of health, and many of them have gone to the shades of darkness. Some others have entered on board His Majesty's ships to get clothes to cover their nakedness, which is to the shame of America. He's also writing home, telling what he knows of people, of fellow Salemites and Essex County people he knows in prison, to hopefully get some of that news back and forth. Apparently his wife never wrote back to him, which is really kind of sad. He does manage to escape. He ends up trying to sign up to a privateer ship that's being fitted out in Amsterdam. That gets delayed, and then he ends up, as I said, taking another year and a half. He gets off the ship at Cuba, and then finally makes it home. His health is broken by this experience, and he dies in 1787, as his grandson says, in a state of impoverishment. But the plight of prisoners in England was cleverly highlighted by Benjamin Franklin, who, as we've heard, encouraged friends in England to aid the prisoners with both food and a chance to escape. Although, interestingly, in another letter, Caleb Foote basically rips into Franklin, saying he's not supporting them at all. He was supposed to help us. People, supposedly were sent to help him, and they never arrived. And he's directly is mentioning Franklin as somebody he's angry with. But the Americans, the New England folks, particularly the Essex County folks, who are in these prisons, though, are articulate and they are literate. There's a higher literacy rate in New England than there ever was in England. And so you have these folks who are pretty primed to be talking about this debate on liberty. And one of the things that they were doing with these prisoners was, especially at Fortin and Old Mill, was indenturing them out to local communities to provide labor for the farms. And so they're talking to the locals, and this is one of the ways that they're, managing to organize escapes. And so the debate on liberty there's a debate on liberty going on within the Whig Party in Parliament, and it gets broadened into prison reform and humanitarian questions. And it is possible that this was one of the greatest impacts that privateering had on Britain. It divided the political parties and ultimately caused a loss of support for the war. So with the end of the Revolution, privateering also came to an end. In 1783, shortly after the news of the Treaty of Paris reached America, John Pickering wrote to his brother Timothy saying, quote, "There were many persons in Salem dejected on the return of peace, but a greater spirit of industry arises among the inhabitants than I expected to see after the idleness and dissipation introduced by the business and success of privateering." One may conclude that John Pickering's investments were not as successful as he would have liked. So Essex County quickly found its feet again after the war. It weathered a real economic depression in the years after. But it had its fleet, it had its money, and it was able to then focus on opening international trade for the region. And by the 1790s, it was looking at another economic boom from trade beyond the Cape of Good Hope. But that, I believe, is the symposium that Bethany did last year. Thank you. Any questions? Yes, ma'am. What year did I graduate from Penn State? I was at the Penn State Harrisburg campus, and I got my MA in 2001. We are Penn State. Back row? I'm sorry, the light is right in my eyes. I can't. That is the debate. So there are no records of women on privateering vessels. I think Eric identifies like one possible one in his book, but there's no contemporary evidence for it. It's one of these stories that pops up in the 19th century. We do know that there are records of women serving on Royal Navy vessels. We do know that Deborah Sampson, for example, in the Continental Army. Especially early in the war, I'd be doubtful because you're generally talking about a pretty closed local population. And so, if somebody's coming in saying, yeah, I'm the youngest son of the Gardner family, somebody's going to be like, they only have 2 sons. So we don't have any records of women actually serving on privateers. Not to say that there wasn't. One of the problems that we deal with, all of us, is that the records for privateering are sketchy. So we don't have a lot of records of this, and this is something that it's not new. I was looking through pension records, or Ruben actually was looking through pension records, and realizing that a lot of the pensions that the privateers are putting in the early 19th century are being rejected because they have no documentation to back up their claims that they were serving on privateers. So that's a long answer to your short question, but yeah.
And the captains didn't bring their wives?
No, that was not really a thing that was done at that period. You start to see that a little bit more on whaling vessels, where they're out for years and years and years.
Are there a few, how often have you found
Yep.
their lives
So there are three questions. One was about the British record, where I was finding British records. So there's a weird little database that's out of Holland that has scanned a bunch of these interrogatories, the lists of questions that captured privateers are asked. I think this afternoon we're going to be hearing a lot more about the prize papers. They're part of the prize papers. So I was able to find this, as I said, it's a weird little database. Unfortunately, you have to pay $35 for 1 day's worth of thing, and it doesn't allow you to download anything. So I was big mad and taking a lot of notes when I finally figured that out. So the second, about the enslaved people, crew lists for privateers are very, very rare, and the ones that at least I have seen do not have any. They don't list enslaved people as something separate. However, they are not adding descriptions the way they would on, say, a Seaman's Protection Certificate or a later crew list. So unless you know the names of African American families, it's going to be hard to tell who might be black and who might not be. There are, the ones that we know of are folks like James Fortin, who sort of after the fact sort of talk about their privateering experience. There's one little mention that I came across of a guy from a Salem privateer whose name escapes me now, that he actually describes that his crew went to prison, but the black guy on the ship ended up being taken as a servant in the gun room on the vessel. And so he was definitely a privateer, no name, no antecedents. And then when it comes to enslaved people captured as prizes, yes, that was happening. Elias Haskett Darby's The Grand Turk is one of the more famous of those. One of his prizes has 9 enslaved people on it. And those enslaved people were sold as part of the prize in Martinique. It seems like a lot of the enslaved people were generally resold into the Caribbean, especially after 1779, when the Martinique opened for Vice Admiralty. The auction records that have survived, again, are a very specific point in time, and it's only one auctioneer. or 2 auctioneers, and they don't record the sale of any enslaved people as part in Salem or Newburyport. That's not to say it couldn't happen. Again, these are only one set of auction records, but generally the ones that I have seen that are captured on vessels. And also generally these would be folks who were being shipped as enslaved people, not folks who are serving on a vessel. So there's a difference there. Okay.
Wow, so much new information. I'm just sort of taking it all in. This is incredible. Thank you so much. I will also mention to your last point before it goes directly out of my head that at Mill Prison, often Boardman in his diary mentions a part of the prison that's set aside for Negroes. So that's his wording of it, but he talks about that. So I think there was a significant black population that was at Mill Prison. So a little aside. So it is now break time. You get to go stretch your legs, get some more coffee, get a snack. We gave you an extra long break so you can talk to each other and our wonderful speakers, and also potentially re-up your parking on your car or move your car if you're in a short-term lot. Sorry about that. If you want to move to the parking garage, that is all day, and you won't have to worry about it again. So we will see you back here at about 11 o'clock.